The war comes home. It's a warning.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
The single greatest sacrifice I've made is my family.
We weren't out there to take country. We were out there to do something. That was our job.
I did feel a lot of regret.
Friends were still getting killed.
It got to the point where, you're going to funerals quite often.
Do I lead under fire?
And that was a heavy responsibility, I guess, on my shoulders that I didn't want to screw up.
War itself is horrific. It's a horror story. It should never be dressed up as if it's something glorious.
Not what you can do for yourself, but what can you do for your country.
The volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
I'm Alex Lloyd, and you're listening to Life on the Line. Mark Wales is a veteran of the Special Air Service Regiment, and this is the SASR veteran's third appearance on the podcast. I interviewed Mark in 2018, Season 2, about his life in the military and life after service.
All I wanted for me was to come home. I think they just wanted to make sure their brother came back in one piece.
In 2021, Season 5, Mark came back on the show to discuss his memoir, Survivor, Life in the SAS, and share new stories from his time in uniform.
A war like that will turn good men bad and bad men evil.
Since then, Mark has continued to achieve new goals, from going back on the reality TV show Australian Survivor and do what he should have done the first time, win, and star in George Miller's epic film, FURIOSA, a Mad Max Saga. He has also released his debut fiction novel, OUTRIDER, which is what we're here to talk about today, as it draws heavily on his time in the SASR, fighting in Afghanistan, and more. We're recording this podcast in the Pan Macmillan studio. Mark is published by Macmillan, and I'm his publisher. Mark, welcome back to Life on the Line.
Mate, good to be back. That's a good phone voice.
Well, our publishing journey together actually kind of started, it did start through Life on the Line. We met through that first podcast.
Correct.
Recorded in Jan 2018, and then a few years later you hit me up with a book proposal for Survivor, and here we still are, still going.
Yeah, 6 years. But as much fun as Survivor was, I think fiction is a good direction to move in. I think we can do a bit more.
Absolutely. No, and I remember having dinner with you that night, and you were poking me with a lot of questions about the industry, and I should have seen coming that in a year or two I'd get your proposal for your memoir. So, Mark, you and I have personally spent the last couple of years talking about OUTRIDER, but this is the first time someone's actually recording us doing it, so let's actually have an on-mic conversation about it for a change. So for those that last heard you been interviewed, reflecting on your life and writing your memoir, let's catch them up to date. What brought you to writing fiction? Why are we here?
So the thing that brought me to fiction was I've got a pretty active imagination. I live on the fringes of Melbourne on a hill, and it's a fairly remote area, heavily forested. And I'll just be driving around thinking, this is a pretty amazing little community. Imagine what would happen if this was a defensive position. The story kind of formed under that basis. I've got a 6-year-old son, Harry, and my wife, Sam. And then based out of that, just how would you act if there was a conflict? How would we behave? How would our society form itself in new pockets and new tribes? That to me was a really interesting kind of thought experiment. I thought this could be a good story, and I think when we did that first treatment, which was about 9,000 or 10,000 words, I think we read it and went, yeah, this could be something.
Yeah, how do I turn my son's daycare to the site of an explosion and an ambush, etc.? It's all there. OUTRIDER, what's it about?
OUTRIDER is a story about a father and a son trying to escape a civil war set in the near future in Australia.
What is an outrider in this world you've created?
An outrider is one of the elite Special Forces troops, one of the few remaining Special Forces troops from the invasion that has not been hunted down or taken out of action, and they run the resistance effectively. They're the top troops in the resistance, and they help run missions against terrible Australians that aren't on our side and also foreign adversaries.
Also, although the outrider term is concept of what they are is fictionalized for the sake of the novel, they're effectively the best of the best of Special Forces. And you bring in some real-world references, like they're the only body under AUKUS authority that can direct certain types of military assets and so on. So you're having fun using some real-world things connecting with this dystopia.
Yeah, that was a plot device we had to kind of create to put these troops in situations that were going to be really tough. So yeah, I mean, it's not that far from the truth, really. I mean, if you get top special ops, soldiers, they're generally paired up with other government agencies or intelligence or whatnot, and that's kind of how you bring the best of government to bear.
So you talked a couple of questions ago about your seeing life on the hill in Victoria, and you're imagining how would this be a defensive position and so on. Very officer of you, trying to formulate those battle plans and strategies. But then what's the actual, besides the interesting scenario you're working through in your head for that, why this greater story of civil war? I guess what's the emotional inspiration behind telling this dark future of Australia?
I think there's a bit of a well-worn trope in this genre, which could be an external adversary or a foreign adversary. To me, it was a bit too straightforward. What's more scary, I think, is having something that you can kind of recognise that could be an adversary. Some of the best horror films, the antagonist is something that is recognisable or human. And I think in this sense, having an Australian enemy would be quite confronting. And yeah, that's what I've kind of focused on doing.
Because the book's set in 2034, and you kind of take the real world headlines of today and extrapolate what would the worst case scenario be. What if Taiwan is invaded? What if the American fleet falls? What if the Australian military is wiped out? What's the next step? And you just followed the dominoes through to the worst possible conclusion. And so the backdrop is that Australia is partially occupied by foreign forces. There's a large part of Australia that's free. There's some that's no man's land. And we follow this character, Jack Dunn. And he is one of these outriders, and he's in part of the occupied area, and he's got one final mission to complete. And then he and his 11-year-old son, Harry, earn their freedom to cross the border to free Australia. And the geopolitical situation backdrop is there, and we see some of those foreign forces in action. But as you just touched on then, the bulk of the action is Australia versus Australia, that there's local collaborators, they're working against the resistance who we've painted as the good guys holding out for those true values. So what inspired the choice, I guess, for it to be that Civil War focus rather than Australia good, foreign invaders bad? You made it much uglier by us fighting ourselves.
Watching it from the other side is what gave me that idea. I mean, we would go to Afghanistan, we would effectively choose a side in what you could deem a civil war. So we didn't back the Taliban, we backed their opposition forces, the Northern Alliance or a totally different group. So what would happen if someone came to Australia? They would back, I guess, a non-insurgent force to fight another element that they wanted to deal with. And it's just imposing that same framework on Australia. And when you think about it, you're like, that's pretty awful, but it's also what we do overseas quite a bit.
Well, that's it. You're taking the reality of what you witnessed in Afghanistan and just applying it to home.
The war comes home. And if you don't like that, then it's a warning.
It's not just as a plot device or world-building setup. You explore all the detail of how that plays out. Things like, on both sides, fathers are involving their sons in the fighting. It's not the battlefield somewhere over here and society's over there. It's asymmetric warfare. It's guerrilla tactics. It's messy.
It becomes a part of life. You don't get to, I guess, leave your job and have a life as a soldier deployed. The war is at home, so you have to live with this war around us as well. That's what I think. When you think about how a society would work, I mean, that's to me what made it interesting. I saw it in Afghanistan. They had to live while there was a war kind of raging all around them.
And as they have to do now in conflict still going on in the world, in Ukraine and Gaza.
We get to pack up and go home when we're soldiers deployed overseas, but in Australia in 2034, we don't get to.
Well, I hope your version of it doesn't come true. But you've taken these lessons from deployments, and even, I feel like, just some of the elements of combat. I feel you've taken things you've seen or done and stuff that's happened in combat scenarios you've witnessed, and you get to channel it through fiction.
Yeah, it grounds the scenes, I guess, with a bit of lived experience in war zones. And I think that just offers another layer of authenticity, which just makes it a slightly better reading experience. It can be a bit jarring if you're reading a scene where you know it hasn't been done properly or it's not authentic. It kind of pulls you out of the story for a moment. So I think that's the advantage of being an author that's had that experience. I can kind of bring it to life a bit more on the page.
Absolutely. There's one of the first chapters, there's an ambush at a roundabout and an explosion goes off. This is in Melbourne, this scene. and the explosion that goes off, some nasty characters meet a rather nasty end, but it's the way you describe it is what really stays with you. I feel like the graphic detail of what the injuries are like, but more importantly, how they react to the injuries, the sort of human emotion and outcry and how they process it and the shock, all that stuff. You read that and I read it in a way and I think, oh, he's seen that.
Yeah, and I guess the tension in the moments before you know something's going to happen, that's a feeling I remember really explicitly, and it's I try to bring that kind of tension to the page, because when you know there's something potentially really threatening happening, it's just an awful feeling, and try to put it in there.
A couple of the characters, they have a military dog and they also have a robot. We'll get to that, but I feel like the robot is basically a sci-fi version of a working dog as well. How is writing the dog handler content?
The robots that are there, we're going to see more and more of that, I think, on the battlefield, and I've tried to introduce the early stages of that with these Aussie soldiers or these insurgents that have, robots with them that they grow quite attached to. And I had read stories about operators and explosive ordnance diffusers that had their own diffusing robots that they grew really attached to, and when they lost the robot to an explosion, they were upset by it. So I've tried to introduce that dynamic too.
And I know dog handlers from SASR and other units. So if a dog's lost, it was a huge emotional thing, and they're treated the same as a fellow soldier.
Yep, they're treated exactly the same. You can protect them. They can be protected with rules of engagement. They medevac the same as a soldier, so they're important.
You're a long-time reader, and so I can imagine for you it was this beautiful mix of you've got the real-life experience, you've got the passion for the genre, and you just got to have that playground of smashing the two together and seeing what came out on the page.
Yeah, it was good to have that, I guess, as much breadth as you want, but it's also hard because you've got to have a narrative arc that kind of works and fits together, and I think keeping it tight and focused so it doesn't stray, that was hard.
Just sticking on the world building for a fraction longer, what's fun in the novel is because the world kind of goes to shit from 2024 to 2027, there's all like the brands and pop culture and civilian manufacturing, all that stuff is still in 2034, what we have today, frozen in time because the world kind of stops. But obviously, as we know, war is the best proponent of advancement in arms and certain kinds of technology. And so therefore the tech they're fighting with is super advanced, whether it is the sort of robot that's kind of like a working dog, but a four-legged little robot, or an AI-powered mine, or even guided rounds from a sniper rifle, like weather manipulation as well. You extrapolate some stuff that we kind of know exists in the military sphere, but we don't really know out in the civilian world, and some stuff I think you've just totally gone to town on. But how much do you know, and can you talk about you extrapolating what that future military tech will be like? Yeah,
I always read a lot on what the US is working on, which is an advanced technology or an advanced capability. Obviously, if they do it to a good level, it becomes compartmented and you won't hear about it. But you can see the nascent stages of certain things like invisibility cloaking, small guided rounds. They've all that stuff exists. They haven't widely deployed it yet. So I thought, why not bring it to life here and have the US bring it over to Australia and test it out.
As I've said, you've created the worst case scenario for entertainment purposes effectively. This is kind of like a gritty, grown-up version of Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden with more commentary, and it's different in some ways, but it's a good comparison to make that. But do you look at this gnarly future, and how likely do you think this future is?
So I don't think it's likely that Australia would be occupied. However, a war in the Pacific, I think that's a real risk for Australia, and I think we need to consider what our way of life would look like if we couldn't protect our shipping lanes or just run an economy. Basically, we go backwards a long way. I think I remember reading that somewhere, that if we were blockaded as a country, our economy would go back to a kind of 1950s, 1960s economy. So you'd have this high-tech war going and we'd be really back to basics, and we can't build a lot of stuff here in Australia at the moment.
What you write about mostly is, like we said, the Australians fighting Australians, that Civil War aspect. I think there's still that interesting idea of, if we were starting to suffer as a country, what would we stand for? What would we fight for?
If you've never been a soldier, what would you go out and fight for? I think it's an interesting question, and a lot of people probably don't ask themselves. If a few bad things happen, like you lost power, for example, there was a study done by a US research agency. They said if we lost power for 12 months, 95% of the US population would die. It wouldn't take too much for society to go backwards dramatically.
Well, you're exploring the worst case there. It's obviously all written for entertainment. It's for no other purpose, and we hope it just stays in the land of fiction. The thought bubbles are there, and there's really interesting, provocative stuff to think about. On the surface, it's also just, as the Sydney Morning Herald called it, a gritty action tale, or as Books and Publishing called it, a high-octane thriller for fans of Lee Child, Chris Ryan, and Matthew Riley. You could tell I'm a book publisher plugging it. So the action's great. The premise is really interesting, but at the heart of it, there's the characters as well. And you have fun whether it's with the badass CIA agent Constance, or it's Jack Dunn, our outrider, and his young son, Harry. So can you talk to us about how you came up with some of these characters?
Yeah, I felt like if there wasn't enough high-stakes human element to the story, it wouldn't resonate as well. And I think by introducing a child, the guy's child, who's Harry, who's a young man, he's only 11 years old, that just is a complication for the protagonist that he's got to deal with. He's got to fight this war and achieve these missions while making sure his son survives intact through what is a terrible time. So I think that's a good tension.
Speaking of the kind of pace of it, you, as I touched on in the introduction to you, you were in the most recent Mad Max film by George Miller. And I know that the filming of that and the audition process even, that was all occurring while you were writing this book. So how did George Miller's hellscape kind of influence your own version of Australian hellscape in the future?
So I remember George Miller talking about his version of how people would live in the future if society stopped, and they would worship these machines that would outlive humans. And there were just a couple of really interesting tweaks on how culture would change over time. I think I was halfway through the manuscript by the time I actually went onto the set of Furiosa, but it was such a good example of the detail needed to really build a story well. They take their film detail so seriously. Like, you look at anything they've built, the murals on the side of the trucks, whatever, it's all done to perfection in the vision that he has for that world. So I try to take a leaf out of that book and copy his process for building a future world, for sure.
So now you've written a novel. What was harder, non-fiction or fiction?
Fiction was harder by a long way, because with non-fiction, and we were talking about this last night at a book launch, with non-fiction, you're really taking parts of an already existing story and just crafting the right narrative arc for that information. With fiction, you got to build a new world, new characters, new storyline for everyone. So it feels like 2 or 3 times the mental horsepower to do that and then translate it to the page and not have it be a total, mess of a story. I think that really took a lot more work, more than I thought it would.
Well, as you say, this week we are launching Outrider, out now in all good bookstores, available digitally as well, ebook and audiobook. What's next for you then, Mark Wales?
Well, I think we give Outrider a good shove out the door, and if people want more of it, I think we can definitely build that world out.
Mark, it is always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for coming in to talk with me on air about the book, and pleasure to publish you again and work with you again.
It's great that we have brought it to life, and thanks to you and the Pan Macmillan team for your outstanding work.
Get a copy of Mark's book now. You can also go back and get a copy of his memoir, Survivor, Life in the SAS. Also go back to Season 2 and Season 5 of this show to catch Mark's previous podcast appearances. Don't miss when new episodes of this podcast drops. Follow us at Life on the Line Podcast on Instagram, Facebook and YouTube, at LOTL Pod on Twitter, and at Thistle Productions on LinkedIn. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thank you for listening, and lest we forget.